Nan McKay with Kent Watkins, founder and chair of the American Academy of Housing and Communities. We would like to welcome you to the Community Trailblazers Academy Series.
The Academy nominates people in the U.S. and throughout the world who have significantly contributed to the betterment of cities. I think you will enjoy these stories from people who are really there in person.
To stay up to date with our latest videos, subscribe to this YouTube channel by clicking the subscribe button above the video. This is Nan McKay, and this is my second interview with Rod Solomon. You can listen to his first interview from his guest page on our website, trailblazersimpact.com. Rod has worked in the affordable housing and community development sectors for the last 4 decades, creating laws and programs and regulations for affordable housing. He has some considerations about the current status of subsidized housing and what he sees in the future, both the near future with the new administration and maybe a little longer term view. Rod, as a fellow for the American Academy of Housing and Communities, you've worked in both the public and private sector, and both for HUD and housing authorities. So let's talk about your experience at HUD. You were Deputy Assistant Secretary or equivalent for about 9 years, including doing things like negotiations with Congress to establish the Quality Housing and Work Responsibility Act. So tell me about some of your experiences in getting this passed through Congress.
Well, Nan, first, thanks for talking with me again. And I want to thank all of your listeners for both listening and what so many of them have done to help in these really desperate and unprecedented times we've had in the past year. And also as to HUD, the HUD experience in itself was just great, an opportunity of a lifetime. You don't know without having been there or elsewhere in the federal government what the opportunity is like, really, to just help people all around the nation. So I want to say that to start off. In terms of QORA and trying to get it passed, it was a long journey. I came to HUD at the fall of 1994 with the Democratic administration in place and a Democratic Congress and the elections going on, and thinking that we were probably going to be able to do some incremental legislation to improve public housing. Hope 6 was just getting going at the time for transformation of distress sites, et cetera. And within 6 weeks of my getting there, the Republicans swept Congress with Newt Gingrich leading them and the contract with America that he had. And surprisingly to many of us, they picked public housing to be a main focus and promptly proposed that, that the Public Housing Act, the 1937 U.S. Housing Act, be repealed and that we start over. There was a feeling that public housing was a widespread failure. There were bills introduced with names like the HUD Elimination Act. So we started with a lot to do. What we had going for us was we actually did have a consensus on some basic things. It was clear at the time that while public housing was a success across America, that it did have to change. And the sort of headlines for the program were the Cabrini Greens in Chicago and Desire in New Orleans with 100 acres of distressed housing, and other places where it was just clear that the housing had failed, kids shouldn't be being brought up there, et cetera. There also had been ideas kicking around for a decade that there was some consensus on, like a merger of the so-called housing certificate program and housing voucher program, and some others. So there was some basis to work from, but nevertheless, it took over 3.5 years. The first Congress, we failed. We couldn't get it passed. We did get some preliminary legislation passed that everybody could agree on, And some of that was important. It was, we got the, there had been a 1-for-1 replacement requirement for all of public housing, which sounds like a great idea, and in theory it is. But these large distressed places, you basically couldn't do anything because there wasn't the money. There weren't other sites to replace the housing, and you had to have something to be able to reconfigure the places and do new construction where needed and all of that. So we agreed on that. We couldn't agree on deregulating housing authorities across the board, but we agreed in 1996 on something called Moving to Work, which we called a demonstration then, but it's still going. And at the time, we were to choose up to 30 well-performing housing authorities and see what they could do. So that got started, but we couldn't get the bill passed. That took 2 more years. And basically, it took taking everybody's best ideas, listening to everybody, Republican and Democrat, but also sticking to the principles, sticking to, well, you know, we're for public and assisted housing. We want all this to work. We want to make sure that it stays focused on the people who need the housing the most. And especially in the voucher program, where you didn't have this problem of large concentrations of households at one site, where they could be spread throughout the community, the thinking was, well, we could serve many more extremely low income persons in that program, and it would still work okay, kind of keeping to those kinds of principles, taking ideas that had been, that people agreed on, like the voucher certificate merger that I mentioned, adding where we could. For example, even from my experience in Boston, I could say a few things about what ought to happen with large troubled housing authorities and what kind of powers the government ought to have to deal with them if they had to go into receivership or otherwise be dealt with harshly or reconfigured, and we could get agreement on that. So eventually it worked through, and by the end of the process, we lost 1 vote in the House, but otherwise it was unanimous. And of course, that was just the start because we had to implement it. But that's a little bit about how it got through. And it probably wouldn't have made it, even with all of that, if the leadership in that year hadn't decided that this is going to be on an Appropriations Act, a must-pass legislation. So that's how it got through. And what it meant to us as staff, for example, is there were about 8 weeks, I would say, in the late summer and early fall, where the staff of the House, Senate, HUD representatives from both sides of the aisle from Congress met in a confidential, what you might call conference, but it was staff, to work out all the details of this massive bill and kind of get down to business. And a number of issues didn't get decided until the very end, but ultimately it got done.
What did you feel were some of the implementation challenges of it, of that, and maybe any new initiatives while you were at HUD?
Well, just to do Quora, we had to do about 40 proposed and final rules. So that in itself was a challenge, and probably the only way we got them done in any kind of real time is as we were writing the bill, we encouraged Congress to give us deadlines that we had to do it by X day so that we could use it with everybody in the administration, frankly, to do that. But then there were plenty of course, substantive implementing challenges about getting some of these initiatives going. I do think that there were some big things that came out of it. We did a capital fund financing program that financed about $4 billion in capital improvements over the years. I think the voucher changes, the merger of the programs was successful and has supported now what's the largest deeply subsidized housing program. I think we got public housing off of the logjam that it was in so that there could be substantial redevelopment. I think although the Cabrini Greens linger on, and it's no longer, I think, dominates the program. I think that management is better, and from those years also, not necessarily in Quora, we also overhauled the project-based voucher program. That's been a major tool for public housing redevelopment. From that, and a little bit later while I was there, we developed something called the Public Housing Reinvestment Initiative that, along with other important ideas from places like the Millennial Commission and Harvard, became the basis for the Rental Assistance Demonstration, or RAD, and also for other kind of parallel conversions of public housing to project-based vouchers, where you could basically, the idea was get some more money in the system by allowing private financing. And so I think some of that came out of those years. There were plenty of important things we didn't accomplish, but there were some big things too. I'm sorry for the digression.
That's fine. What challenges do you see the new administration potentially tackling?
Well, the new administration, the pandemic has to be front and center. And I'm mostly going to talk about housing, where I have a little bit of expertise at least, but across the board, certainly if there were ever the proverbial drinking from the fire hose, the new administration has that. They've got the pandemic and the fallout from that, the economic fallout from that, the sort of spotlight on racial equity that all the tragedies of the past year have highlighted, and climate change, as if there weren't enough else, as well as just running the government in a good way. And that's all reflected in what they've got to do in housing. They've just the rental assist, just stopping the evictions issue and the emergency rental assistance. If the administration gets what it's seeking in the pending bill, the emergency rental assistance is about the size, is really larger than, or about the size of annual HUD budgets in itself. And it's, of course, it's paramount to get that money out promptly and well. But when they get that, then they'll get back to what you would have thought would have been home plate or square one, which is that even before the pandemic and continuing, only about 1 in 5 households that are eligible for subsidized housing, deeply subsidized housing, are able to get it. And we would be back there. We will be back there. And promptly, the administration will have to do what it can to deal with that in a variety of ways. And they've proposed a variety of ways to do that. And certainly it's got to be a combination of production, a substantial expansion in the voucher program, which will be critical, as well as other initiatives like in public housing.
Let's talk about the imminent and the potential future of public housing as a program. What do you think is the current status? And then what do you see as the future status?
Well, as I said, I think the current status is there have been some gains from 20 years ago in terms of, I think public housing management is generally better. They've done a better job of reaching across locally for partnerships, more of a realization that public housing is a platform, but people need a lot of help beyond housing, and that the housing authorities can be catalysts for education initiatives, healthcare initiatives that are critical. I think moving to work has helped in terms of being able to give authorities some ability to innovate in some of those areas and housing areas themselves. So that's good. And the RAD program, which Congress said, okay, you can do this conversion from public housing to long-term rental assistance and then borrow against those rental assistance contracts and issue tax credits, all to raise money for public housing. That's been a success, and they've now financed over $10 billion in public housing improvements. So that's something. But on the other hand, over the last generation, until very recently, we've underfunded public housing significantly. We still are, to an extent, even though it's been in a significant extent, even though it's been better the last 3 years or so. And as a result of that, mostly, we've lost a number of public housing units, and a number of experts estimate now, and the industry groups estimate a so-called capital backlog of needs to just fix the roofs, fix the boilers, fix the windows, make sure we have basic decent conditions, address lead paint, address mold, all those things, is about $70 billion. So and New York City estimates 40 billion alone just there. So we've got our challenges. On the other hand, we've got some proven approaches. And in the last Congress, the House of Representatives passed $70 billion in the Moving Forward Act for public housing capital, and $25 billion in another act as sort of a adjunct for infrastructure to the appropriations bills. But that's one house. And what the administration can do now, and given what's got to be done for the pandemic and other infrastructure, climate change needs, et cetera, it's a big picture, so it remains to be seen. But I'm hopeful that level of support indicates a new sort of consciousness of what's got to be done. And you could let some of that money, if there is a large chunk of money put into the capital fund, if some of it could be used for ongoing RAD rents, for instance, you could leverage lots of capital work. So we don't know how much capital will be able to be appropriated. It's obviously not and should not be infinite, but we hope it'll kind of address needs, and Congress can maybe do that if it needs to, partly in terms of raising the RAD rents. There are other things other people have proposed. HUD has made progress relying more than HUD did, including in RAD, on the sort of higher subsidy tenant protection vouchers to combine with RAD. And that remedies a substantial need to get deeper into these developments that need more rehab than RAD, which Congress passed with the stipulation that it couldn't cost any more money than public housing is able to fund. So what I'm hoping is that we can use that opportunity, that the administration can work with Congress, and that to have a substantial upswing or much broader level of addressing the public housing capital backlog, and to preserve this housing for the long term, to preserve this housing for low-income households who are still needed, and that we'll manage to do that even with all of the other pressures that are going to be on the administration and Congress.
What people may not understand that are not in our industry is they may say, well, why don't you just tear it down? You know, if it has mold and mildew and it has plumbing problems and it has electrical problems, what's the point of rehabbing it? But explain to people a little bit what the consequences are if you tear down public housing.
Well, I think in some instances where the situations you describe are severe, it may have to come down, and some of it has. But the consequences are we've still got this pressing need of only 1 in 5 people even able to get assistance. We don't necessarily have the sites in the communities to locate public housing well. We've learned from the past that large concentrated developments are difficult to manage and difficult for the families who are trying to succeed there. We have to come up with the money to replace them if that's what we're going to do. So it needs an assessment. There are some circumstances where that should be done, and we can fund it, but we've also got to figure out what's most economical. And in the end, it's not about the public housing because it's public housing. Although it needs to be protected for low-income households, but it's also not about that the current sites there's some sort of that they have to stay exactly the way they are, and many of them shouldn't. But it's about how do you best serve this pressing need? And in a number of situations, renovating the housing and making sure that the protections are there to preserve it for the families who really need it is what should be done.
And perhaps giving a voucher is not always the best solution, is it?
Not always. In many circumstances, it may be, but in some communities, you could provide a voucher, but you're not finding the housing. And in other communities, it turns out to be much more expensive, or where people could go would have to be far from where they are now. So again, it's a mix, and communities are different, and we've got to deal with the different situations across the country. But in many instances, preserving the public housing is what will work out best.
You have given us a great update and overview of the current situation. I really appreciate that. Do you have anything else that you'd like to add?
I appreciate the opportunity to have done this, and this maybe to be repetitive, but I do hope that everything that the nation has gone through and the disparities that have even been highlighted further by the pandemic and the racial tragedies of the past year have raised consciousness and the challenge is even if we're able to get a major effort going now and through this administration, we've got to sustain it and sustain a sort of higher level of political support for all of this than we've had for most of my career. So that's what I would hope and hope to contribute to.
Well, thank you so much, Rod. I really appreciate your time and the words that you have to say, because you've been there, you do understand the issues, and you can explain it in a way that everybody else can understand, whether they're in the industry or not. So thank you much.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this video, please join Kent and me, and please subscribe free to this channel. Share it with your friends and click on the thumbs up icon to like us.